At this time, I'd like to introduce Roy Terwilliger, former state senator and the CEO of Flagship Bank and one of today's sponsors, who will be doing the honors of introducing Governor Pawlenty. So please join me in giving Roy a warm welcome as well.
Good afternoon. One of the things when you say you're going to introduce the governor, it kind of leaves you lacking for words, because how do you introduce the governor? I think I would rather phrase this is a welcome to the governor, for him to come back and join us again this year. And I've known this for a couple weeks. I was going to have this opportunity and privilege, and that's a rare privilege to get to introduce the governor and someone that you'd worked with before and everything. And so actually a couple weeks ago, as I think about it every now and then, I'd say a little prayer, say, what should I be saying up here? What should I really say to welcome this guy? How do I say it? And, as I was driving out here this morning from downtown, I'd been downtown to a meeting, and all of a sudden this, I don't know, it was a truck passed me or what, this big voice come booming over my shoulder, said, "You should have written it down, you idiot." So I didn't write it down, and I thought, well, were I to have written it down, I would have written something similar to what you have in front of you. And I would say something about 39th governor of the state of Minnesota, one of the youngest governors, one of the most talented governors, innovative, energetic, reform-minded, accomplished. It's all here. His 7 years as governor, he has balanced the budget, a huge deficit, without raising taxes, 3 different times biennially. And it looks like you're going to have another opportunity to do the same thing. I was downtown this morning, as I mentioned this, and as I was sitting in this booth in this restaurant, and for once I was early and the guy I was having breakfast with was late, I was looking at all these little sayings they have up on the wall. And one reminded me kind of the legislature. If you think the legislature is being a patient and somewhat ill, excuse me, Dave Han and Jennifer Loon. Anyway, the little sign said, "And the patient refused an autopsy." If you think about it, the patient probably needed an autopsy after this legislative session to go back and look at what in the world is going on here. The lack of ability to be able to bring things through on time and to do things in a way that would meet the needs of the state of Minnesota. I would say that while the governor's from South St. Paul, as are you, David, and he does have a lot of roots in this particular area. His wife, Mary, grew up in Edina and graduated from Edina High School. His 2 children, along with the governor and his wife, attend Wooddale Church in Eden Prairie. So he's very familiar with our particular part of the world. But most importantly here too, he's very familiar with the business community. And the business community here and throughout the state of Minnesota owes a great deal of gratitude towards the governor. He has toed the line on taxes as he said he would. He has, what I would say, done more things that would come under the category of bold and courageous. And so we're extremely fortunate, and I feel extremely fortunate, to be able to welcome to this luncheon, once again, the 39th governor of the state of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. It's a delight to be back with you at the Eden Prairie Chamber of Commerce, and I am honored to continue on as the governor of the state of Minnesota. One of the great advantages and privileges of this job is you get to travel around the great state of Minnesota. You hear from Minnesotans. They tell you their concerns, their ideas, their suggestions, their tales. Some of them are even true. And this is a true story about my wife and I. We were out at our Eagan home not long ago, and unlike the governor's residence, our house in Eagan is a modest size, and so when somebody's speaking loudly or yelling in one room, you can hear it through most of the rest of the house. And with my schedule, when I'm home, my wonderful wife Mary reasonably and understandably expects I will do my share of taking care of the kids and parenting, and that's a fair expectation. But we were all home together a month or two ago, and Mary was busy on the computer, very engaged in whatever work project she was on, and our younger daughter Mara was yelling out in a nagging fashion, "Mom, Mom, Mom." And Mary said, "Ask Dad. I'm busy, on a work thing." She said, "Ask Dad." And in a mischievous tone, Mara said, "Okay." She said, "Dad?" And I yelled out from the room I was in, "Yes, what is it?" And she said, "Can I borrow a pair of your underwear?" So that just underscores the importance of having the right people asking the right questions and providing the right answers. And I thought that's a good theme for my remarks today about Minnesota's public policy perspective and a little bit about balance, not just budgets being balanced, but being balanced in a broader sense in our state, in our society. Before I launch into all of that, I want to make a few introductions and acknowledgments. First, we have Senator David Hann here, and Representative Loon, I think, is somewhere in the room there. We have two folks who don't make a lot of money being legislators. I think $30,000+ a year. No matter what you do, you get your shins kicked because somebody doesn't like that you voted this way or that way. And so you have in this area two extremely capable legislators who do a great job. And let's give them a round of applause for serving as well. We have many other public officials in the audience as well, and school superintendents and city council members and others, but I also want to acknowledge one of our cabinet members, David Metzen, who is a commissioner of higher education in Minnesota, recently appointed. Some of you may not know that he was my high school superintendent when I was at South St. Paul High School, and of course we're both Packers, and we're mutual friends and acquaintances with Doug Woog, who's a legendary hockey coach from South St. Paul, went on to coach at the university. And when asked about my governorship, Coach Woog said, "Well, I cut him as a hockey player. He wasn't much of a hockey player. I cut him from the varsity team, but I guess he's an okay governor." But whatever I learned, I have to blame Metzen for. So David Metzen, our Commissioner of Higher Education. And beyond all of that, a couple of thoughts about our great state in the session that just concluded. You know, and I know, the nation and the states face great challenges. We have the worst economic slowdown in 60 years, really since World War II. So what that means in kind of the Reader's Digest version is the revenues coming into state government, and almost every state across the country, are slowing down. So what we used to collect in sales tax and income tax and business taxes and the like used to be up here, and now they're down here. And so the revenues aren't what they used to be. Now, if I went around this room and asked in your family life, in your business life, are the revenues the way they were a year or two or three ago for you? I bet for most of you, you'd say no. That most of you are living on flat or even maybe declining revenues for a while in this economic crisis. And the same is true for state government. So what we're really asking, what I'm asking state government to do, is to reflect the reality of just about everybody else in this historic economic crisis, which means at least for a little while we get through this crisis, hopefully not more than another year or two, maybe sooner it will get better, but at least for a little while, we're going to have to get by on a little less, just like everybody else. So as your family budget got capped or reduced, or your business budget got capped or reduced, state government's going to have to do the same. So what does that mean in real terms? In the current 2-year budget cycle that we're in, and it ends this July, so we're coming to the end of the current 2-year budget cycle, we spend about $34 billion, give or take, with little adjustments here and there. But it's basically a $34 billion budget. The forecast in Minnesota said, well, we don't think you're going to spend $34 billion in the upcoming 2 years. We think you're going to spend something like, $35 or $36 billion. And by the way, you only have about $31 billion coming in the door in revenue. So when you hear about the $5 billion budget gap, that's basically how it materializes. So the question arises what to do about that. Unlike our friends in Washington, D.C., a novel concept, Minnesota actually has to balance its budget. That's a good thing. It is difficult. It can be unpleasant. It can lead to a lot of tension. But in the end, it's an extremely important requirement and discipline and responsibility and duty. And what the Constitution of the state of Minnesota says, by the end of a 2-year budget cycle, your book's got to balance. And so that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And so that's what we have as a duty and responsibility. The question is, how are we going to do that in light of the data that I just gave you? Now, when I talked about balanced budgets, that's really important, constitutionally and otherwise. But it's also a broader notion of balance, which is in terms of Minnesota's multiple commitments, multiple responsibilities, multiple priorities, where are we in or out of balance compared to, say, the rest of the nation? You know, what are the things that stick out in terms of things that were maybe too high or too low on in terms of bringing the state back into some reasonable balance? Some things to keep in mind as a backdrop to the discussion. If you look at Minnesota's budget, two-year budget from 1960, the time that Elmer Anderson was governor, till now, when I'm governor, the average two-year increase in the state's budget during that period of time in the general fund was 19%. 19%. The state of Minnesota has been on an absolute spending spree in the last 40-plus years at a rate that I think would shock most of the people in the room. Most Minnesotans don't know that, but when you have an economy now that's growing very little, actually growing in negative terms, or not growing at all, you know, is that kind of continued spending pattern really reasonable, responsible, or sustainable? In my view, no. It is out of balance in that regard. Another question is, people say, well, are we in balance or out of balance in terms of this being the kind of place where people would like to grow jobs? Because let's face it, we love our quality of life. It has many components to it, but one of the key components for almost every Minnesotan is, do you have access to a job? Hopefully a good paying and stable job with benefits. So the question arises, where are jobs going in the country and in the world, and why? And is Minnesota positioned to get its share and more of capital deployment, entrepreneurial risk, research and development, the commercialization of research and development, the building of buildings, the purchases of capital equipment, the adding of employees? And if not, why not? What are the barriers to more of that activity occurring in our state? And time doesn't allow to go through all of it, but here's an interesting question and answer. If you want to see where jobs are growing and why, then an answer, well, how can we be more like that? Then we have to look to where jobs are growing and why. If you look at recent history from 2003 until the economic collapse of 2008, and you rank order every state in the United States of America by job growth from highest to lowest, you will see that nearly every state above Minnesota spends less, not more, on government than we do, in terms of where the correlation is between job growth and government involvement and intervention as measured by spending. Now, there's a few exceptions to that, but they tend to be places with aberrational circumstances like Hawaii, Alaska, New York, and a few others. But almost every state above us has a lower level of state spending, not a higher one. I share that with you because there is a school of thought in Minnesota rooted really in the 60s and 70s, but it still reflects a lot of the thinking of the chattering class, the apparatchik, the editorial boards and the like, which says basically the pathway to a brighter economic future is to some degree, to some significant degree, higher taxes, more government, and the like. And I would suggest to you, this is not the 1970s, it is not the 1960s. We live in a very different world, culturally, demographically, technologically, economically, and the like, that this is now a hyper-competitive environment, the likes of which we have not seen, and to suggest the pathway forward is the pathway backwards in terms of more taxes and more largesse in government, I don't think is modern thinking. In fact, the statistics show just the opposite. If you want to attract capital, if you want to attract entrepreneurial risk-taking, if you want to attract the deployment of capital in the business environment, the states that are experiencing that kind of behavioral pattern and job growth pattern tend to be states that are in the South and the West. There's a massive shift in demographics, economic deployment, and all of what I've just described from the Northeast and the Great Lakes states to the South and to the West. And I'm not talking about California and Oregon, I'm talking about the mountain states and the like. And the question arises, well, why is it? What are the characteristics about those states? Well, I'm not here to suggest Minnesota needs to be like them. We led in Minnesota the job growth from 2003 to 2008 of all the Great Lakes states except one. So you can go from Minnesota to the East Coast along the Great Lakes and see that we were the leader of the entire region in job growth during that period. And you might say, well, Governor, that sounds pretty good. There's a problem with that, though. That isn't where the jobs were growing in the country. We led the laggards. and the same is true for the Northeast. And so I am not here to suggest to you that we need to or should become the bargain basement place that we have to undercut some other states whose names I won't mention. All I'm suggesting to you is that we are a high-cost state already. And if you increase the cost of our state further and push us further out on the competitiveness range, and we're out there already, it will be a further deterrent to entrepreneurial activity and job growth and business activity in our state, and in a way that I think will be very detrimental in the intermediate and long term. So that is my proposition. And I think it's important to keep in mind when you look at the Forbes magazine index, when you look at the small business misery index, when you look at the ranking of tax burdens, when you look at job climate indicators, not by Republican or Democrat, but by credible third-party sources as to where they place Minnesota for that kind of activity, we are in danger of pricing ourselves out of the market. So with that backdrop, my friends on the other side of the aisle came forward this session and said, you know, in the interest of making this budget balance, we need to raise taxes some more. And their proposals included across-the-board increases in the income tax and creation of a new fourth-tier income tax. Know that Minnesota already is one of the highest tax states in the country. Forbes magazine said for non-business taxpayers, we're the fourth highest in the country. The top tax bracket in Minnesota at 7.85%. Again, already one of the highest in the country, kicks in not at $1 million, not at $500,000, not at $250,000, not at $100,000. It kicks in for about $70,000 of income for an individual. So this notion that it's going to be shifted all to the the so-called wealthy at that break point is not supported by the facts. The other thing you should know is that when you increase income taxes in the state, you are also increasing income taxes on just about every small and medium-sized business in Minnesota because they're organized as pass-through entities and they pay their taxes on their individual returns. So it's a massive tax on small businesses across Minnesota. So I'm not obsessed around these notions for the sake of I just hate taxes. I'm obsessed about it because I do not believe Minnesota is positioned for the competitiveness that is coming, is already here, in terms of our tax policies and business policies. And the other thing I would suggest to you, it's not as if we were a low-tax state to begin with. We're already at the high end of the range. And as you know, you don't have to increase rates to get more revenue if the economy is growing. If the rates remain the same and the economy grows, you get more revenue. So my proposition is we're going to have to tighten the belt, and that's what this session was primarily about. The session went for 5 months, from January to May. The legislatures, not David and Representative Loon, Jennifer Loon, but they didn't get the job done. And so we had a 5-month debate regarding these issues, and the constitutional deadline for them to finish the work ran out, and the budget doesn't balance. So the bills that I signed into law now spend more than we have, and they have to be adjusted. And there's a process in Minnesota that allows the Commissioner of Finance to determine that the revenues are not what we thought they would be, and that the needs can't be met on the spending obligations that we have, and that empowers the commissioner to declare an unallotment authority opportunity. So as I said before, people are sick and tired of politics as usual around the Capitol. They don't want to see some pathetic special session drag on all summer. They don't want to see some government shutdown where the services discontinue on July 1st until the knuckleheads, that in their view, over at the Capitol can get things organized. And so we got bills now in place that will keep all the services going, but they're going to have to be adjusted. Now, before I take your questions, I want to just touch on 2 other aspects of balance. It is not just about cost as to where people decide to deploy capital and grow jobs and build buildings and do all the things that we need to keep this economy going. There's other factors that go into it, and one of which is, do you have a education system, a job training system, a workforce readiness system in place that is robust and appropriate and relevant and rigorous for the economy of today and tomorrow? This is more important than ever because unlike a generation or 2 ago, the safety net in the form of the strong back job where you could miss the educational rung for whatever reason and still go down and get a job as in our hometown of South St. Paul, cutting meat, loading and unloading stuff, and expect to make a living wage and get a full benefit package, those jobs are gone. And so now we have to have a skill, all of us, or an education that's relevant to the economy, and if you don't, you get marginalized in a big hurry, and you become in whole or in part a ward of the state. Now there's a lot underneath this statement, but the number one barrier of why we have some of the social and socioeconomic dysfunction in our society is we have families who are struggling, in some cases children who are living in environments that are very challenging, but we also have a skill and education gap for those who are struggling economically. In many cases, they don't have a skill or an education to meaningfully access this economy. So we have to improve our educational system and opportunities. I think, candidly, it starts with making sure that we have parents who are engaged, who are focused, who are enabled, who are involved in their children's lives. Unfortunately, we can't legislate that, but whether you're a governor, a legislator, a mayor, a community leader, everybody should be talking first and foremost about what we know about poverty. You can almost eliminate or at least greatly reduce the likelihood of anybody being in poverty if you do these three things. Graduate from high school. Do not have children until you are in a stable relationship or at least able to reasonably take care of them. And don't have children until you're married. Better yet, or at least in a stable relationship. If you do those three things, you statistically eliminate, or nearly so, the likelihood that you're going to end up in poverty. Now, that doesn't sound like a real challenge for those in this room, but for many of our fellow citizens, those are big challenges. But as a community, as a society, we have to say it's not okay to have a third of our kids dropping out of high school in the United States of America, in a world where if you don't have an education or skill, you're marginalized. It's not okay for young people to keep having before they're ready, children in situations where they can't parent them and can't be responsible for them and can't bring them up in a way that is going to increase the likelihood or be likely that they're going to be okay. We have to have a different cultural perspective around what's happening, and what's happening is we've got too many kids having kids in situations where they can't afford them and can't raise them and can't bring them up in a reasonable fashion and a responsible fashion. And that's not to say we condemn those individuals, but it is to say we better elevate and celebrate and recognize the need to encourage different choices, different behaviors, and the like. And it's okay to say that, I think. I'm going to say it. Number two, we also have to have an educational system that's more modern on a lot of different fronts. And I won't go through the whole list, and unfortunately the legislature didn't act on these things, but we cannot continue to have a school system that is a one-size-fits-all, pay-for-seniority system. You have a great school system in Eden Prairie. You're very fortunate. It's high-functioning. You've got great leadership. The results are really good academically, and I just saw the state champion high school boys hockey team over at the school an hour or so ago. So you're very fortunate here in this part of the state. But the truth of the matter is that is not the same story for many of our fellow citizens across Minnesota. We are not interested, I'm not interested in continuing to pay for how senior the staff is or how many inputs on the formula get tweaked, like how many bus miles you drive and how many years you've been around and how much your heating costs and what concentration of this or that you have in your school district. That's all of interest, but it's a cost-based system where most of the money goes into inputs and costs. The system, at least for the new money, has to be aligned to results. And the results that we want and expect are whether students are improving their learning, not as measured against Eden Prairie or Edina, but for your students as you find them from Labor Day to Memorial Day. Can you make reasonable progress with student achievement? And unlike 20 or 30 years ago, we can measure that precisely by class, by student, by teacher. Now, the teacher unions hate this, but it needs to be said, and I'm going to continue to say it directly and boldly. We do not want to continue to pay for seniority and cost inputs. We want to pay for better performance and results. And we are putting lots of money into places that for 30 years have been producing crappy results. And it needs to change. And they need to be held to account on those scores. And I pushed it as hard as I could this year. It was ignored, but I'm going to continue to push it. Very lastly, and then I'll take your questions, we're out of balance on health care. Minnesota is a great state. It's a generous state, but our welfare and social service and health care systems are off the charts in terms of the national averages and norms. We've got programs other states don't even have. We're talking about reducing some of them a little bit compared to the rest of the nation. They don't even exist. Now, it's a reflection of our generosity, but we also have to realize that we can't have one part of the budget so outrunning everything else that it impairs our ability to even modestly fund our other priorities. The GAMC program, which I unallotted or vetoed the other day, I should say, is a program that is growing 35% a budget cycle. 35% a budget cycle. You have a school district here who's wondering how they're going to live on flat revenues for the next 2 years, while we have a healthcare program that is growing 35% during the same budget cycle. Helping folks who are in need on welfare and the like is an important obligation and responsibility. It's part of who we are. It's part of what we need and want to do. But we cannot let it get so out of control that it impairs our ability to responsibly fund other key things we are also supposed to do, like fund our schools, like build roads and bridges, like fund our colleges and universities, and have an economic development and job climate and tax policy climate that's reasonable. We have a health and human service and welfare system in the state of Minnesota that is out of control. Not isolating on that one program, overall it's growing 22% a budget cycle. There's nothing in state government that is growing anywhere close to that, not even close. So we shouldn't be struggling to find 1 or 2% for our schools when we got, on autopilot. It doesn't even take a legislative decision because it's all on entitlement spending, 20, 30% increases in these other programs. So we're going to be looking at adjusting some of those programs. Those are not easy choices. They are hard choices. But it has to be balanced against the ability to do the other things that we need to and must do as well. So this is not the outcome of the session I would have chosen. It's not what the path I would have chosen, but it's the path that we're on. And I wasn't going to stand by when we had another option and watch a summer, a fall of special sessions, government shutdowns, the politics of the Capitol as we know them, as usual, I thought should come to an end, and that's why we chose to go down this path. So I'd be delighted to take your questions and comments, and then I think we have a few awards, or you do, to give out, and we'll get out of your way so we can get on with your day. And Metzen, no golfing today here at Olympic Hills. You've got to get back to the office. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it very much. If you got questions or comments, just shout them out. I'll pick them up. Yeah, go ahead.
Last year you talked about trying to get a handle on the cost of education. My daughter's a senior. I'm looking at college. It's amazing. Have you made any progress? You talked about online learning being one of the options that schools could be considering.
Yeah, thank you. I think your question relates more to higher education. Yeah. The cost of higher education has grown tremendously. David used to be the chair of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents and served in that capacity for a number of years. In the bills that were passed this year and signed into law, there are tuition caps. They're kind of soft caps, but it expresses the intent of the legislature to try to limit tuition increases, and that will help, but it may not solve all the problems because it builds on a pretty high base. A lot of the challenge we have now is if you are truly poor or disadvantaged, there's lots of programs for you. If you're wealthy, you can afford it. The folks who are kind of falling in the gap are the middle income folks who are too wealthy to get help or much help and not wealthy enough to pay the whole thing. So that's really where the problem or the challenge lies. Some things in my view is the system needs to get much more efficient. I love the university, I love our state college and university system, but you can't continue to have a system where the main instructors teach not that many number of hours a week. We can't have places like Normandale Community College where 14 people are on sabbatical, and they get a sabbatical every 6 years. You can't continue to have people's health care insurance, you get to retire at age 50 in some cases in the education world, and have your health care paid for the rest of your life at taxpayer expense. We can't have the University of Minnesota try to purport to be everything to everybody everywhere. They have to make some strategic decisions about their focus, and they are, but it's slow and it's evolutionary rather than more reform-minded. So you had it starting with Ken Keller. You'll remember him. Some of you are maybe old enough to remember Ken Keller. He had a commitment to focus, and the university's commitment and the state's commitment back to him was to throw them out. President Udoff had a similar idea of focusing and prioritizing the university. He went on to Texas and now California. And President Brunix is doing a reasonably good job, I'd say a good job, trying to continue to narrow the focus. But we asked the university to be a world-class teaching and research institution. We asked the university to be a land-grant college to accept for undergraduate education all the students that they serve, and that's great. We also asked them to operate this mammoth extension service where they're supposed to go out and educate citizens and stakeholder groups from everything from how bees, pollinate to tree, disease to, fertilizing your lawn, and do all of that with world-class excellence. It's a big mission. It's a big institution. And so I think they should think about focusing their mission more tightly horizontally and improving the quality vertically. I also think the power of technology is going to revolutionize higher education within the next 20 years in ways that higher education policy makers and leaders don't even see coming. Do you really think the generation that's behind us is going to sit in a classroom and be lectured to by some assistant professor who may not know jack, as opposed to sitting in their living room and call up in a lecture on demand when it's convenient for them, where it's convenient for them, anywhere in the world, best of class, world-class quality. I mean, give me a break. I mean, you really want it, it's not going to replace higher education, but it's certainly going to substantially alter it and change it, and it's exploding. So we've asked our state college and university systems to get 25% of their classes online by 2015. Some are already there, some are halfway there, but it's going to be revolutionary. You can go right now online, get classes from the University of Southern California, Harvard, Princeton, Oxford if you can qualify. I don't think they even see what's coming. And then lastly, I would say we got too many institutions trying to do everything everywhere. And if you want to make this system more efficient, we only have 800,000 kids left in our K-12 system. Now we have non-traditional students as well. That number's going down to 700,000. Most of the non-traditional students are nighttime students or online students, but not all of them. But we have way too many institutions trying to do everything everywhere in the state. We need more flagship programs that focus on excellence and that don't duplicate each other 6 times around the state. For example, if you go to the Wisconsin system and you want to be a packaging engineer, University of Wisconsin at Stout has the Upper Midwest premier packaging engineer program. You don't have 6 of those in Wisconsin. They got 1 and it's really good. You go to Stout. They don't try to replicate it at La Crosse and Madison and 3 other places. Minnesota is not in that mindset yet, but the demographics and economics and online learning will bring it to that point relatively soon. And beyond that, we funded it reasonably well this year compared to some of the things they were facing. Yes?
John Howard, Governor Pawlenty. This past legislative session, I worked with the Minnesota Association of Health Underwriters with Senator David Hand and Representative Steve Dotwell quite extensively in House File 1865. That would have the prospect of using private policies to fund Minnesota care recipients and so forth, with multi-million-dollar savings projected. I was wondering if it ever made it to your radar screen, and if so, if you were
It did, yeah. The question related to our Minnesota Care program and whether private sector approaches could be integrated within the Minnesota Care program. We saw that. I like the proposal. We've had variations of it proposed in the past. It is strongly objected to by the maestro of Minnesota Care, Senator Linda Berglund, out of Minneapolis. So it's a good idea. It's one I support, but the current legislature does not support it with enough votes. So that's where it sits. Yes?
Follow-up to your radar screen, in your third budget cycle, have you considered criminal justice policy regarding incarceration rates comparable to others? What's that cost, or is it such a small line item that you haven't devoted much time to?
No, we devote a lot of attention to it. Question related to criminal justice policies. Minnesota in general incarcerates fewer people as a percent of the population than almost any other state in the country. But the people we do incarcerate, we keep in longer. And it's a function of 2 things. Because we incarcerate fewer people, we tend to focus on the more serious offenders. We use probation and parole, community approaches much more than other states. So you can't look at our sentencing and say it's shorter, it's longer. But as a percent of the population, we have fewer people in prison. Minnesota's been criticized over the years by having too expensive of a prison system, and we've made some progress in bringing those costs down. But one of the things we've done is built a lot of prisons in recent years because of the projections for growth in the prison population, primarily around sex offenders. And I think that's a good thing. We do not want these people on the streets. The serious sex offenders, in my view, we want to keep them out of the community settings. If you finish your sentence in Minnesota, criminal sentence as a sex offender, and you're still a danger to society, you can be what's called civilly committed. You have to treat those individuals with state-of-the-art treatment programs. It's about $300 a day. It costs about $80 a day to keep them in prison. So those are some of the economics that we're running into. But the big run-up in prison population has been in sex offenders and meth-related crimes that we boost up. Now, there's a myth that you might hear from time to time that we have non-serious, low-level, first-time property or drug offenders sitting in prison, and the call is to let them out. And I disagree with that for this reason. If you look at the criminal history of the offenders who are in prison, property and drug offenders in prison, they are not first-time minor offenders. You got to be a bad apple to get into prison in Minnesota. You don't stumble in there on your first, marijuana offense. That's not how it works. I mean, you got to be a bad apple to get into our prison system, and once you're in, you stay a while. But the average number of prior offenses for a drug offender in prison in Minnesota is like 7 or 8. And that's when their first trip into prison. And the average number of prior offenses for property offenders in Minnesota is about the same. So we have folks running around saying, if you want to save money, let those, property offenders and drug offenders out of prison because they're just first-time, low-level, nonviolent offenders. That's not true. They are big-time, repeat, chronic offenders, most of them. Yes.
We hear these ads on the radio talking about move your business to South Dakota.
Don't, please don't.
It's my understanding that we also run the same ads. And can't we have a gentleman's agreement to kill those ad campaigns and save those states some money and save our own states some money as well?
We actually don't run those ads. We do some tourism ads, come hunt and fish and vacation in Minnesota, but we don't run the kind of ads that you hear from South Dakota coming over here. And again, this proposition, people say, it's just about Pawlenty being pro-business. You cannot be pro-job and anti-business. Business needs oversight, it needs proper review, but being pro-job and anti-business is like being pro-egg and anti-chicken. We cannot have a future in this state where everything's built by government, everybody works for government, or the nonprofits or the grant recipients. You actually have to have a private economy where entrepreneurs want to build stuff, start stuff, invent stuff, commercialize it, repair it, manufacture it in your state. And I'm telling you, the warning signs are on the dashboard. The market is indicating that we are not as competitive as we need to be. And again, I'll just make this point and I'll close and get out of here. Minnesota's business tax rate is the 3rd highest in the world. It is 9.8%. That is the 3rd highest, if Minnesota was a country, of the OECD nations. So if you look at Michigan, people say, what happened to Michigan? It's economically in enormous distress. Now, let's look at some of the similarities between Minnesota and Michigan, setting aside the dysfunction of Detroit. Michigan is an upper Midwestern state. We're an upper Midwestern state. Michigan's a Great Lakes state. We're a Great Lakes state. Michigan has a proud tradition of Midwesterners who work hard and they're friendly and they have a good work ethic and traditionally, again, setting aside the dysfunction of Detroit, a strong educational system. So does Minnesota. They have a great tradition of public universities and colleges, the great flagship university of the University of Michigan, one of the best in the world, land-grant college, sounds a lot like our University of Minnesota. They got a similar system in Michigan State. And they've got a high-cost government. What happened? Up until the economic collapse of 2008, there were more cars being built in the United States of America than ever before, by a significant margin. They just weren't being built in Michigan anymore. There are reasons for that. Over time, management and the unions escalated their costs to the point where they were unsustainable and uncompetitive. There's a lesson for that in people who are smug about their relative position in a hyper-competitive global economy. And it's not limited to the auto industry. There is a flight of capital formation, a flight of entrepreneurial activity, a flight of risk-taking and the commercialization of research and development out of Michigan. And you might say, but wait a minute, if we have a high-tax place with great universities and smart kids and hard-working employees, won't people come to our place? And the market's telling us that there is more to it than that. And we need to be competitive on a variety of fronts. I will close with this. Notwithstanding all the challenge that we have, this is a great state. We lead the nation at or near the top of just about everything. The point is we want to keep it that way, but do not leave here bummed out. This is a state that has the #1 ACT scores in the country and continues to hold that place. Depending on what survey you look at, we're either first, second, or third healthiest state in the nation. We ring the bell on all sorts of quality of life measurements in terms of research and in terms of outdoor activities, in terms of charitable giving, and every imaginable measurement of quality of life. If we're not #1, we're certainly top 5 or so in just about everything. So this is a wonderful state. We are actually improving on a lot of different measures. But the world continues to change, and it's a dynamic process. And so we can't look back and say, gosh, there was a moment in time 20 years ago where something good happened. We got to be focused on what we got to do to position for the future. And that's why we're having this discussion, this great debate in Minnesota about our business and job and tax climate. And I got a different view of it than my friends on the other side of the aisle, but it's respectful, and we'll continue to put our case forward to Minnesota. And thanks for letting me come here today to do that. Thank you very much.